The axe came down, and it did not kill. The crowd gasped as steel bit not into neck, but into shoulder flesh, splitting in a grotesque spray. The woman, grey-haired, stooped with age but burning still with dignity, refused to kneel, refused to bare her neck like some docile lamb to slaughter. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, daughter of one duke and cousin to kings, twisted away from the trembling young man who held the axe, her eyes blazing with defiance, even as blood seeped into the grass of Tower Green. What should have been a swift moment of justice, or at least of death, had turned into a nightmare. The executioner swung again and again, hacking wildly, missing his mark each time. Shrieks filled the air, not from her, but from the witnesses, ladies clutching their veils, soldiers averting their eyes, noblemen sickened by the sight of royalty, reduced to butchery. By the time it was over, the Countess no longer resembled the proud matriarch she had been, but a dismembered ruin at the foot of the block, a body that told the story of cruelty, incompetence and vengeance disguised as law. Imagine standing there in the damp air of London, the shadow of the tower looming like a black sentinel. You hear the caw of crows circling above their cries, mingling with the muffled sobs of the spectators. You smell the iron of blood, heavy on the wind, mingled with the acrid smoke of torches. You see with your own horrified eyes a scene that even the most hardened executioners would later whisper about in disgust. It was not the death of a traitor. It was not the death of a criminal. It was something far darker, the slow destruction of a human body, because one man, Henry VIII, King of England, willed it so. This was no ordinary death. Margaret was 67 years old, her hair silver, her body frail. She was not a warrior to be struck down in battle. She was not a rebel, caught brandishing arms against the crown. She was a grandmother, a noblewoman, a survivor of England's most dangerous political storms. And yet, on that May morning in 1541, she was dragged from her prison cell and forced into the open air to face the axe. No priest at her side, no son or daughter permitted a last embrace. Just the cold gaze of officials and the trembling hands of a boy executioner ordered to perform a killing he could not manage. The crowd did not cheer. There were no shouts of triumph, no declarations of loyalty to the king. Only silence broken by the wet thuds of steel on flesh and the horrified murmurs that rippled through the onlookers. A spectacle meant to enforce fear had instead planted revulsion. And in that revulsion, in that stunned silence after the screams, one question hung heavier than the tower's stone walls. How had it come to this? How had the daughter of the Plantagenets, born into one of the noblest families of England, ended her life, hacked apart like an animal beneath the shadow of the king's fortress? The answer lies not only in her blood, but in the paranoia of a monarch, in the web of betrayals that threaded through Tudor England, and in the cruel irony that the most powerful lineage in Europe became the deadliest curse for those who bore it. And so, to understand the horror of that axe which would not kill, we must journey back to a world of silken halls and gilded cages, where a woman once lived not as prey, but as privilege itself. She was born into a palace of velvet and iron. Velvet because the halls of her childhood glimmered with tapestries and gold, with courtiers bowing as she passed, whispering her name with respect. Iron because that same childhood was forged in the merciless fire of royal bloodlines, where a smile could conceal a dagger and every embrace might be a prelude to betrayal. Margaret Pole entered the world not as a common girl, but as a Plantagenet, a name that still made hearts tremble in Tudor England. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, brother to King Edward IV. Her blood was laced with kingship itself, the blue fire of dynasties that had once ruled England with unquestioned might. As a young girl, she learned the rituals of court, how to bow just low enough to flatter, how to speak with grace, how to hide her true thoughts behind a mask of courtesy. At feasts, she sat beneath glittering chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine minstrels plucking sweet melodies on their lutes. She grew up surrounded by the ornaments of power silks imported from Florence jewels, glimmering like frozen stars, and the great tapestries that told stories of her ancestors, knights who had conquered realms and defended crowns. For Margaret, such grandeur was not privilege, but expectation. It was the air she breathed. Yet even in this early paradise, shadows fell across her path. Her father, the Duke of Clarence, would meet a traitor's death when she was but a child drowned. Rumour said in a butt of Malmsey wine at the order of his own brother, King Edward. In that moment, Margaret learned the cruelest lesson of all royal blood was a double-edged sword. It could raise you to the heavens or plunge you headfirst into the grave. Still, she carried herself with dignity, surviving where so many of her kin perished, her resilience like tempered steel beneath silken gowns. By the time she came of age, Margaret had married Sir Richard Pole, a loyal supporter of the Tudors, and she found in him a quiet refuge. Their union was not the stuff of ballads, but it was steady and respectful. Together they raised children, and Margaret carved out for herself a role not as a schemer, but as a matriarch. At Warblington Castle, nestled in the Hampshire countryside, she presided over her household like a queen in miniature. The castle stood firm with its red brick walls, its halls echoing with the laughter of children and the clatter of servants at work. It was here that Margaret tasted something rare in her turbulent life peace. Imagine her strolling the castle gardens at twilight, her cloak brushing against lavender and rosemary, the air scented with summer blooms. The horizon glowed gold as the sun sank beyond the fields, and in that moment, one might believe that this woman of royal blood had escaped the curse of her lineage. She raised her children to be learned, pious, and loyal. She was entrusted with positions of honour, serving as governess to the young Princess Mary, the beloved daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Her household became a centre of education, refinement, and quiet strength. But there was always the invisible cage, the knowledge that she was watched. Margaret's blood tied her irrevocably to the Plantagenets, that extinguished dynasty whose ghost still haunted England. To the Tudors, her very existence was a potential spark of rebellion. And though she smiled though she lived dutifully, the bars of that gilded cage grew closer with each year. In the shimmering peace of Warblington, Margaret seemed safe, even blessed. Yet beneath the tapestries behind the stone walls, history was sharpening its knives. For in Tudor England, paradise was always fleeting, and the higher the bloodline, the deadlier the fall. The first cracks appeared not in stone, but in whispers. England, once bound to Rome, now shuddered under the weight of a king's obsession. Henry VIII had broken from the Pope to seize his divorce, to crown Anne Boleyn his queen, and to make himself the supreme head of the church in his realm. With that single act, he severed centuries of faith and loyalty. And in the silence that followed, suspicion spread like plague. Margaret Pole could not have failed to notice the shift. She had once been close to the royal family, her own hands guiding the young Princess Mary through lessons. Her council valued her loyalty beyond doubt. But when Henry cast aside Catherine of Aragon and declared Mary illegitimate, Margaret's loyalty was tested in fire. She dared to defend Mary, treating her as the true princess, despite the king's decree. That act of maternal devotion planted a seed of danger. For in Tudor England, loyalty to the wrong cause could become treason. Yet it was not only Margaret's devotion to Mary that stirred unease. Her sons, proud scions of the Pole name, carried their Plantagenet heritage like banners, and Henry could not help but see in them potential rivals. Chief among them was Reginald Pole, Margaret's brilliant, devout son, sent abroad to study theology. From the safety of continental Europe, Reginald raised his voice against the king's new order. His writings denounced Henry's divorce, condemned his claim as head of the church, and declared him a tyrant in the eyes of God. The words of a scholar written in distant cities might seem harmless, but Henry heard them like daggers flung across the sea, and when Henry listened, so did his courtmen, eager to curry favour by pointing out traitors. Reginald's defiance gave them the perfect weapon, not only against him, but against all who bore his name. It was said in whispers that Margaret shared her son's views, that she secretly passed letters that her household harboured sedition. None of this could be proved, but in the venomous world of Tudor politics, proof was rarely needed. Imagine the atmosphere, candle-lit corridors, where courtiers leaned close, murmuring that the Countess of Salisbury was too dangerous to be left unchained. Spies slipping into her household listening for a careless word. Servants watching their mistress with downcast eyes, then repeating her every movement to those who paid for secrets. Margaret's castle, once filled with laughter and learning, began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a stage upon which unseen eyes gazed. The irony was cruel. Margaret, now well into her 60s, was not plotting rebellion. She lived quietly, her strength devoted to her family, her faith, her memories of a vanished age. But in the eyes of Henry VIII, that quiet dignity was itself a threat. Her name, her lineage, her bloodline, these were dangers sharper than swords. Every breath she took reminded the Tudors of the dynasty they had destroyed, and so the seeds of doom were sown: a mother's loyalty to a discarded princess, a son's fiery defiance from afar, and the jealousy of a king who could not abide any rival, living or dead. The soil of England was already thick with betrayal. Soon, it would drink once more of noble blood. It came swiftly, as doom always does. No trial by battle, no warning in the night, only the pounding of fists upon castle doors, and the royal warrant unrolled like a death sentence already signed. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was accused of treason not by any action of her own hand, but by the defiance of her son, Reginald. His words, penned across the sea, were turned into her shackles. In May of 1539, the king's men came to Warblington Castle. Imagine her standing in the hall that had once echoed with children's laughter, now filled with the hard clank of armour and the rustle of parchment. The warrant named her a traitor, her possessions, her lands, her titles seized, her dignity stripped away in a single breath. A woman who had governed with wisdom, who had taught a princess, was reduced to a prisoner before the eyes of her own household. Servants who had once knelt to her now shrank back in silence, fearing even a glance of sympathy might condemn them. The journey from Warblington to London was not that of a noble lady, but of a captive. Through villages and towns, she was paraded, the people whispering as she passed. Some pitied her, remembering her honour and her age. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to be caught watching. To the court, the spectacle was the point. This was what happened to those who clung to the old ways, who dared to oppose the king's will, even from afar. And then the tower gates swallowed her. Those black iron doors, heavy as sin, slammed shut behind her, and in that echo lay the certainty that she would never walk free again. For the tower was no mere prison. It was a graveyard of dynasties. Once you entered its stone maw, you belonged not to yourself but to the king's justice, which could mean months of silence or the swift edge of an axe. Margaret was not the only one ensnared. Her family too felt the tightening of Henry's trap. Her son, Henry Pole, Baron Montague, was arrested accused of conspiring with Reginald. Geoffrey Pole, another son, was dragged into interrogation so brutal it nearly destroyed him. Cousins, allies, retainers, all fell beneath suspicion, their lives devoured in the king's hunt for enemies. It was not just one woman's downfall. It was the unravelling of a great house, the Plantagenet line, hunted to extinction under the banner of Tudor vengeance. The accusations against Margaret were vague, built from scraps of gossip and forced confessions. One so-called piece of evidence was a white tunic embroidered with the symbol of the 5 wounds of Christ, discovered in her possession, a sign the crown declared of her support for rebellion. In truth, it was a common emblem of piety, hardly treasonous. But in Henry's England, piety could be twisted into conspiracy faith, into sedition, silence, into guilt. In the cold rush of those days, the Countess's fate was sealed. She had not drawn a blade, nor spoken words against her king. But the crown needed no proof, only fear, and Margaret Pole became its perfect victim. The trap had closed, and within its jaws, even a woman of 67 winters could be devoured whole. The Tower of London is not merely stone and mortar. It breathes. Its walls hold the echoes of prayers whispered before dawn, the muffled cries of men awaiting the axe, the laughter of guards who know their keys open both doors and graves. Into this place, Margaret Pole was cast, and there she lingered day after day, month after month, her once vibrant life shrinking into the chill of damp corridors and the rustle of straw bedding. She was 67 years old, an age when most noble women of her rank would have been surrounded by grandchildren, warmed by the comfort of hearth and chapel. Instead, she was surrounded by shadows, her every step watched, her words measured. The cold of the tower seeped into her bones, gnawed at her joints, and turned sleepless nights into long vigils of despair. There were no silk gowns now, no tapestries to soften the stone. The Countess of Salisbury lived as a criminal stripped to coarse garments and coarse food. Loneliness became her most relentless jailer. Friends who might once have sent letters or tokens of comfort fell silent. To aid her was to risk the king's wrath. Her beloved Reginald was far across the sea, condemned as a traitor. Her other sons were imprisoned or dead. The network of family that had once been her strength was torn apart strand by strand, until she stood alone in the dark. She was not simply punished in body, she was abandoned in spirit. That was Henry's true cruelty, to leave her alive long enough to feel utterly forsaken. At times, she would pace her cell, her slippered feet brushing the rough stones, whispering psalms beneath her breath. The sound of the river beyond the tower walls teased her with the memory of freedom water flowing endlessly while her life was stopped in chains. In the distance, bells tolled for Mass, but she was denied the solace of a chapel, left only with her own whispered prayers. She must have wondered if those prayers reached God at all, or if the tower's walls smothered them as it smothered every cry for justice. The guards treated her with a blend of fear and curiosity. Some mocked her, quietly sneering at the fall of a great lady. Others avoided her gaze, ashamed to witness such age subjected to such cruelty. Perhaps a few pitied her, but pity was useless in a kingdom where pity could itself be treason. In the silence of those months, Margaret endured not just the decay of her body, but the slow erosion of hope. She did not know the day or hour of her death. That was the king's prerogative. And in that uncertainty lay a torment greater than the axe. Every knock at the door, every jangle of keys might be the summons to the scaffold. Her enemies called her a traitor. Her jailers called her a prisoner. But in those silent hours, Margaret Pole was something else entirely. A woman suspended between life and death, clinging to her faith as the only thread left unbroken. Justice in Henry's England was a mask, a grotesque theatre, where the verdict was scripted before the accused even entered the stage. For Margaret Pole, the trial was not a chance to defend herself. It was the final act in a play written by her enemies, performed only to cloak vengeance in the illusion of law. When she was summoned, the air in the chamber was thick with expectation. Officials sat in solemn rows, their robes brushing the floor, their eyes fixed on her like vultures waiting for carrion. She stood before them, frail in frame, but unbroken in spirit, her back straight, her gaze steady. She carried with her not only the weight of 67 years, but the silent dignity of a woman who had once walked among queens and princes. Yet that dignity was meaningless here. The court had already decided her fate. The charges read aloud were vague, almost laughably so. She was accused of maintaining communication with her son Reginald, who had dared to defy the king from afar. She was accused of sympathies with Rome, of harbouring dangerous loyalties, of existing as a Plantagenet in a Tudor world. One by one, the accusations fell like dull hammer blows, not sharp enough to pierce truth, but heavy enough to crush her. There was no evidence, only hearsay and the forced words of others. A servant's testimony, twisted under pressure, a tunic embroidered with the sacred wounds of Christ, paraded as proof of rebellion. Any pious woman might have owned such a garment. In Margaret's hands, it became treason. Her silence, too, was counted against her where loyalty was demanded. Her refusal to denounce her own son became guilt in the eyes of the crown. Imagine sitting in that chamber. You would see a woman of noble bearing surrounded by men who dared not meet her eyes for too long, lest her humanity betray their duty to condemn her. You would hear the hollow echoes of a trial that was no trial at all, each word rehearsed, each accusation predetermined. You would feel the injustice pressing down like a suffocating fog, heavy with the knowledge that nothing she could say or do would matter. The verdict was declared swiftly guilty of treason. The sentence, death. There was no pause for mercy, no acknowledgement of her age or her service to the crown, no consideration of the years she had spent loyal to Tudor kings. The law bent entirely to the will of Henry, and Henry's will demanded blood. When the sentence was spoken, Margaret did not plead. She did not beg. Accounts say she accepted it with composure, her faith, her only armour. Perhaps in that moment, she understood the cruel theatre of it all, that she was not being tried for her deeds, but for her blood, for the name she bore, for the defiance of a son who had refused to bow. And so the mask of justice fell away, revealing what it had always concealed, a raw act of vengeance, dressed in the robes of law. The night before her death was not marked by ceremony or comfort. There was no feast of farewell, no priest at her side, no family permitted to whisper words of love. The Tower of London kept its silence broken only by the occasional cry of a raven and the distant splash of the Thames against its walls. In a narrow cell, Margaret Pole lay awake on a straw-stuffed mattress, her thoughts turning over the faces of children she would never see again. She was 67 years old. Her body ached with age, her joints stiff from months in the damp. Yet her mind must have wandered back across the decades to the glittering courts of her youth, to the day she held the hand of the young Princess Mary, to the gardens of Warblington, where laughter once softened the air. Now, all that remained was cold stone and the knowledge that morning would strip her of life. It is said she spent those hours in prayer lips, moving silently as her fingers traced the invisible beads of a rosary long taken from her. She had no confessor, no absolution from Rome, but her faith burned stubbornly against the darkness. Every psalm she murmured was both a defiance of Henry's new church and a surrender to God's will. Perhaps she asked forgiveness not for treason of which she was innocent, but for anger at the cruelty of men who could twist law into murder. At dawn, the cell door creaked open. The jangle of keys shattered the stillness, and the guards stepped in their faces, unreadable. One offered her a cloak for the May morning, carried a chill, though it was not the cold of weather that made her shiver. This was the last garment she would ever wear. She rose without protest, her back unbent, her steps steady. The Countess of Salisbury walked to her death, not like a condemned criminal, but like a woman of royal blood, who refused to be broken. Through the corridors of the Tower, she was led past stone walls, damp with centuries of grief, past the places where Anne Boleyn and Thomas More had once waited for the axe. The courtyard opened before her, Tower Green spread with dew. The scaffold loomed stark against the pale light, the block resting at its centre like an altar to fear. Spectators had gathered courtiers, summoned to witness guards to enforce silenced townsfolk, peering from a distance. Some crossed themselves quietly. Others turned away, unwilling to watch an elderly woman meet the steel. The crowd expected solemnity, a final prayer, perhaps a graceful submission to fate. But Margaret Pole, even in her last hours, would not bend to the script written for her. When asked to place her head upon the block, she refused. She declared she was no traitor, that she would not bow her neck to a false judgment. In that act of defiance, she preserved her dignity, transforming her death into a final protest against injustice. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across Tower Green, as though the very earth held its breath for what was about to come. Her final sunrise had arrived, and with it the hour when dignity and horror would clash before the eyes of all England. The scaffold stood ready, the axe gleaming dully in the pale morning light. A hush fell across Tower Green as Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was led forward. She was frail, her hair silver, her body worn by 67 years of living and months of imprisonment. Yet there was fire still in her bearing. When commanded to kneel and rest her head upon the block, she refused. Her voice rang out, calm, sharp, defiant, that she was no traitor and would not willingly submit to a false judgment. The crowd shifted uneasily. This was not the scene they expected. Executions in Tudor England were supposed to be swift, almost ritualistic, the condemned kneeling, the blade falling, the body carried away in grim silence. But Margaret's refusal to yield shattered that script. She stepped aside from the block, her eyes fixed not on the axe, but on the men who sought to make her bow. The executioner was young, too young perhaps for such a task. His hands trembled as he gripped the axe, sweat shining on his brow, despite the morning chill. He had never before faced a victim who resisted. Ordered to strike, he raised the blade high and brought it down. But the blow missed its mark. Steel tore through her shoulder, a sickening crunch of bone and flesh, and Margaret staggered forward with a cry that was not of surrender but of outrage. Gasps broke from the spectators, ladies clutching their veils, soldiers averting their eyes. Again the axe rose. Again it fell crooked, splitting flesh, but not severing life. Margaret moved perhaps instinctively, perhaps in desperate resistance, her skirts tangling around her feet as she tried to escape the butchery. The boy executioner chased her across the scaffold, hacking clumsily as if striking at an animal. Each blow met, not with silence, but with horrified murmurs from the watching crowd. Blood spattered across the planks, darkening the wood, while Margaret's body bore strike after strike. 7, 8, perhaps even 10 blows it took before she fell, her body collapsing in a ruin of flesh and dignity. The once proud Countess of Salisbury lay mutilated, not executed. What should have been the clean stroke of justice had become the grotesque spectacle of slaughter. The crowd did not cheer. There were no shouts of God save the King, only silence, thick and appalled, broken by the corps of crows circling overhead as though summoned by blood. Some courtiers turned away, sickened. Others stared in horror, knowing they had just witnessed something that would stain Henry's reign forever. Even hardened soldiers muttered that never had they seen so barbarous a killing, so unworthy of England's laws. In that moment, Margaret Pole became more than a victim. She became a symbol of tyranny's reach, of the cruelty that power inflicts when it fears too greatly of the fragility of human dignity, when set against the blunt edge of a trembling boy's axe. Her death was not a warning as Henry intended, but an abomination seared into the memory of all who saw it. Tower Green was silent, but the silence screamed louder than any voice. England had just butchered one of its noblest women. When it was over, there was no triumph, only a dreadful stillness. The executioner, his hands slick with sweat and blood, dropped the axe as though it burned him. He stood trembling, a boy who had been commanded to play butcher and who would never forget the ruin he had made. Around the scaffold, nobles and soldiers shifted uneasily. Some stared at the ground. Others crossed themselves, and more than a few slipped away quickly, unwilling to let their eyes linger on the mangled body of the Countess of Salisbury. The air itself seemed heavy thick with the smell of iron and smoke from torches guttering in the damp morning. A few crows settled on the tower's battlements, their black wings restless, as though even nature recoiled at the scene. Margaret's body lay sprawled where she had fallen, skirts darkened with blood, her silver hair matted and stained. For a moment, no one moved to claim her. It was as if the silence had paralyzed the living. Tower Green had seen death before Anne Boleyn's swift beheading, Thomas More's calm resignation, but this was different. Those deaths, though cruel, had been clean, their edges sharp with ritual and finality. Margaret's was chaos, a storm of steel and screams that left no dignity, no order. The witnesses felt it in their bones. They had not seen justice served, but something darker, something monstrous. At last, guards stepped forward, their faces grim. They lifted what remained of her body, wrapping it quickly in cloth to hide the butchery from further eyes. No procession, no heralding of a traitor's punishment, only haste, as though the crown itself wished to erase the sight as quickly as possible. She was carried to St. Peter ad Vincula, the small chapel within the Tower grounds where so many other victims of Henry's wrath had been buried. There was no monument raised, no noble tomb, only a hurried burial among the bones of queens and courtiers, her name unmarked, her memory left to the whispers of those who dared recall it. And yet the silence spoke louder than any epitaph. Among the crowd that day, men who had once cheered the king felt sickness coil in their stomachs. Women who had once trusted the crown clutched their children closer. Even the officials, hardened by years of executions, knew they had crossed a threshold. England had watched not the death of a traitor, but the destruction of an old woman whose only crime was her blood. The tower itself seemed to brood in the aftermath, its stones heavy with the weight of another injustice. For those who walked its grounds in the days that followed, the memory lingered like a ghost, the sight of Margaret Pole stumbling beneath the axe, the echo of her cry, the silence that swallowed it whole. And though her grave was unmarked, though her name was meant to be erased, the horror of that silence would echo long after the torches of Tower Green were extinguished. History did not let the silence rest. Though Margaret Pole was buried without honour in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, her memory refused to die within the tower walls. Those who had witnessed her end carried it with them, whispering of the horror in corridors and courts, passing on the tale of a noble woman hacked to death like cattle. What Henry VIII had intended as a lesson in obedience became instead a stain upon his reign, whispered with revulsion even among his own courtiers. Her son Reginald Pole, living in exile, heard of her death. Imagine the moment the news reached him, the vision of his aged mother pursued across a scaffold, struck down again and again by a trembling boy's hand. Reginald had already condemned Henry's policies with the pen. But now grief sharpened his words into fire. He became one of Henry's fiercest enemies, a cardinal in service of Rome, forever cursing the king who had slaughtered his blood. Margaret's death, meant to silence the Poles, instead gave them a martyr. Over time, the story of the botched execution became legend. Chroniclers recorded it with disgust. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in shock, noting how barbarous the English king had become. Even in an age accustomed to executions, Margaret's stood apart, an act so grotesque that it seemed less like justice and more like madness made flesh. Her lineage had once threatened Tudor power, but in killing her, Henry revealed the depths of his paranoia. The daughter of Clarence, the last great Plantagenet woman, had been struck down not because of her deeds, but because of what her blood represented, a rival claim, a ghost of a dynasty that refused to fade. Centuries later, the Church remembered her not as a traitor, but as a victim. In 1886, Margaret Pole was beatified by Pope Leo XIII, recognised as one of the martyrs of England's Reformation. The woman Henry sought to erase was instead enshrined as a saintly figure, her death reinterpreted not as the obliteration of a traitor, but as the sacrifice of a faithful servant of God. In that way, she triumphed in death where she could not in life. And yet what lingers most is not her sainthood, but the image of that scaffold. The old woman refusing to kneel, the young executioner swinging wildly, the crowd horrified into silence. It forces us to ask what is power that it drives kings to such cruelty? What is fear that it compels a monarch to butcher a grandmother with an axe? And what is justice when its robes are used to disguise vengeance? Margaret Pole's death is not just a Tudor tragedy. It is a mirror held to humanity's darkest instinct, the belief that authority can turn murder into law. And as long as her story is told, we are left with a question that chills across centuries. If even the noblest blood can be hacked apart when power demands it, what hope is there for the rest of us?